Hey y'all, welcome to the Clock Tower. I'm Colton, here with Brandon. We've got a big show today. We're going to talk about every important deck going into Rumble. Registration closes late next week. You can register for multiple regions as well, so make sure you jump in on that and get registered as soon as possible. Again, links in the description to do that. Also, this is our first show back since the conclusion of our charity livestream event a couple of weeks ago. Thank you so much everyone who donated. We raised over $500 for the Foundation to Decrease World Suck. That money's going to go all over the world to treat child hunger and infant mortality. So thank you so much for your generosity. It was really awesome that so many of you came out and joined us, and that so many of you gave. So thank you so much for that. It was a wonderful event. Final note before we start, the tier list for the community that Kilua puts together, that he kind of assembles based on survey results, is out. Link in the description to that as well. We are going to talk about those community tier list rankings, but we're going to kind of talk about them as we talk about the decks that we are going to discuss on this show. So a lot of stuff to get to. Major tournament coming up, and that means a lot of research that has to be done, a lot of preparation, and we hope that you find this useful. So, without further ado, we have 33 decks that we have identified as potentially relevant for Rumble. This does not mean that they're all top tier. It doesn't even necessarily mean that they're all competitive. But what they are is something that either A, could top at this event if it is equally represented. So if it got, kind of an average meta share, it would have at least an outside chance of securing a top 8, or it's relevant because it's being played. It will show up probably multiple copies, and it is not unlikely that you will run into it. So there's a lot of stuff that is not relevant, right? A lot of old sets, a lot of, honestly bad sets that just aren't even in the running. Monogatari, Gun Gale, Haruhi, these are sets that are both not going to show up, or if they do show up, are incredibly unlikely to top. There are some sets that we're going to talk about that are honestly not even likely to really show up. They might not be there at all, but they're good enough to potentially compete, and we're going to talk about decks that are probably going to be there, but are very unlikely to perform well. If it satisfies one of those two categories, it makes our list of relevant decks. And we're going to have a tier list at the end, so you can see where we decided to rank all of them, but we're going to go through all of these decks one at a time, starting in alphabetical order with Adventure Time. There are 2 relevant decks in Adventure Time, and we're going to start with the one that I think most people think is the best, which is the choice top end that usually plays Standby at level 1, but can also play other things. It came in at 9th in the community tier list with a score of 73. It can close, but is it good enough?
And that's going to be the question of the day, right? The deck really focusing in on that choice top end, really looking at closing out a game with a significant number of burns, and if cancels, burn more. So kind of get that same kind of Musashi effect with additional burns. Getting there is half the problem. It requires a lot of stock in order to be able to play and then use the combo. So getting the stock in place is a little challenging too sometimes. That's why people play with the standby combo that stock charges, the choice combo to bet on the choice triggers to get additional stock. This deck is a little bit more focused on offense versus defense. You're looking at trying to get those burns into play so you can close out a game, closing out your opponent, dealing massive damage at the top.
Yeah, it has a really good closing combo, and that's the thing that keeps this relevant, right? And we've talked about this so many times. If you have a deck that can consistently close from 3-0, you're going to at least be relevant, and that's what Adventure Time does. It will be relevant as long as it has a top end that can close from 3-0 consistently in the meta, and right now it can do that. On the flip side, you have a deck that's almost completely different, which is the 8 Standby Adventure Time list that doesn't run as strong of a top end, but it has the advantage of having the 8 Standby triggers, and you're going to hear us say this a lot, 8 Standby is really well positioned in the current meta because there's not a whole lot that can deal with getting big bodies on board. How does Adventure Time 8 Standby compare to its choice counterpart, though, in terms of relevancy?
The choice list is really looking more at the end game. Standby plays for the mid game, trying to take control of the mid game and essentially win board from mid game on. With that board in place, then it uses that power advantage to then close out a game.
Yeah, its closing combo is okay. It shuffles back and then tries to burn 3 for a pay 2, pitch 2. It's expensive and it's hard to get down in too many lanes. But again, if you can standby it into play, potentially, give yourself an opportunity to save some stock in that way, you can get more of the burns off, and the shuffle back helps more of those swings stick. It isn't as aggressive, but again, if you can dominate the board in the mid game, it makes it harder for your opponents to acquire the resources they need. I don't think it matches up super well into other standby builds, which is going to be a big problem. If this runs into Dal or Slime or the other 8 standby lists we're going to talk about, this one probably has the fewest standby specific tools that really can make standby itself pop off. Next is the old boogeyman himself. Attack on Titan, Wind with a split 2k top end, Aaron into Mikasa. Everyone knows this deck by now. Aaron gets reverses because he's big. On reverse, he gets his free event that lets you plus more characters into hand, and he also bounces back into your hand when someone attacks you. If the AOT player can get their combo off, that's one of the first double plussing combos in English. It really set off the entire meta, and it can build itself into the Mikasa top end, which has a pair of different burn 1 conditions, so it's still relevant in a lot of matchups, but it's going to struggle against stuff that it can't get its level 1 reverse against.
Yeah, the level 1 combo is probably in one of its weakest moments currently in kind of its history, having to face off against very big walls at 1, as well as not being able to get its cross-turn effects off, even if it does get its reverse. It's going to have some struggles early. Realistically, this is probably the lower part of the rating that we're going to see with AOT, especially with it looking to get support in the summertime.
Moving on to Bang Dream. If you run into Bang Dream, there are a million different ways it can be built. 2 of them showed up in the community tier list, one of which is the 8 Pants build that is not going to be out before Rumble. So we're just going to talk about the one, Door Bar. It ranks near the bottom, comes in at 25th. There are a couple of different ways this can be built. They all play that bar top end that essentially tries to fix the top of an opponent's deck so it can stick its swings. There's the level 1 Christmas Kasumi, and then you have the other Kasumi with the Fever effect that basically pulls off the Bunny Girl Union combos with the stock and the top check when your opponent's entire board is reversed. Neither of these are super well positioned right now because, again, this just doesn't get very big, and especially at higher tables, you're going to run into bigger stuff.
Yeah, power thresholds are going to be significantly higher with a lot of standby running around, so it's going to be very difficult to play into something unless you have an answer for the standby matchup.
So this is our first addition to the list of decks that the community agreed were in the meta. We're talking about Bofuri 2 Soul, and I know that has seemed like a bit of a meme, but in actuality, Bofuri 2 Soul legitimately pretty dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, we saw it top in Springfest, and realistically, the meta from that to here is very similar. It has a lot of the very things it's going to be running into, a lot of data live, realistically, a lot of standby in general. Being able to continually push damage is going to be a very big thing, and with the 2-soul combo here and the explosive top end that it has, it becomes a very viable threat, especially in the late game.
It's basically the same kind of thing as Adventure Time, where it has this really powerful closing combo at the top, and the middle of the game is just about surviving and not dying and getting your resources together so that you can actually make the top end pop off. Because if you do make the top end pop off, there's not a whole lot that very many decks can do to defend against it. So it's the kind of thing that you're going to beat pretty often if you have something that's at the top of the meta, but I don't want to see it across the table because I know that if they high roll, there's not a whole lot that I can do. The other Bofuri list is the 8 standby list. This one just squeaked in to the community tier list in 29th. This is another 8 standby list. They're all to some extent pretty similar, but this one isn't quite as well positioned as some of the other ones just because it doesn't have some of the extra pieces that really make standby shine.
The power thresholds on this Beaufort 8 standby list are like just short of what you really want. It makes it very difficult to answer every lane. With that in mind, it can do well, and it has a lot of potential going forward with it. It's just going to struggle a lot with power throughout the game.
Bofuri in general went 2 for 5 in terms of topping at Springfest. Only 5 Bofuri decks showed up. 2 of them got top 8. But we've talked about how Bofuri has been probably one of the most underrated sets in the entire meta coming into this tournament, and I think that 2-soul list in particular could really surprise people and secure another top. Next, of course, we have to talk about 8 Standby Dal. Kurumi has been the queen of this meta for the better part of a year now, basically ever since Data Live dropped. 24% of all decks at Springfest last year were Data Live. 9 of them made top 8, and all 3 tournaments were won by Data Live. This has been an oppressive set, and 8 Standby is its most oppressive list. The Kurumi combo at the top is one of the best combos in the game. The anti-damage Scry engine with the 2/2s on board that let you top check whenever you get a reverse offense or defense, combined with the Toka in the back row that lets you top check and either leave it on top or put it on bottom, makes it so that it's really hard when Dal gets its board down and gets its reverses on defense to stick any damage on the Data Live player. It's been really powerful for a long time. It is the most powerful archetype with 8 Standby, and it can use its 8 Standby triggers and its onboard size to its advantage in ways that no other deck can.
Yeah, it definitely has a lot of tools which make it very viable. Being able to choose the most effective way to close out your opponent at the top end definitely keys into this deck very heavily to be able to deal that precise damage that you need to win the game. It can seal the deal and build up the resources throughout the game, so it has the wherewithal to survive the Swiss rounds and make its way to the top.
And of course, one of the things about Dal that makes it so impressive is that it's not just 8 Standby that can hurt you. One of those tournament winners also ran choice triggers at level 1. Dal Choice Standby is almost as dangerous as its 8 Standby cousin. The level 1 combo is a double plus. On attack, top check, and add to hand twice as long as it's character. And if it's a climax, you trigger the climax and you plus anyway. Choice Standby always has cards in hand. It kind of trades in its massive level 1 board for the opportunity to never be without cards so that it can fix its hand, get its massive board together in the late game. It's not as dependent on the Scry engine. Some don't even run the Scry engine at all, but it definitely is getting its Kurumi combo down, and it's going to have so much resource throughout the entire game that it can basically do whatever it wants.
Yeah, with the combo being able to combine with the 1/0 event to be able to get the event into hand off the combo, with utilitarian power at 1, all the way through up to level 3, and then with level 3 as well, it has that synergy to be able to get the pieces it needs at just about any point in the game in order to be able to most effectively hurt your opponent and build resources at the same time to support that top-end finisher and close out the game precisely.
And as if it weren't enough for Data Live to have the number 2 and number 3 decks in the community tier list, it also has the number 7 deck in the community tier list with the addition of Data Bullet, the extra booster, adding a choice top end to the set that makes the Coterie level 1 combo all the more dangerous in this new 8 choice list that is, again, very capable of topping or even winning one of these tournaments.
Yeah, so it's still running the same level 1 that we saw with Choice Standby, except changing out the top end being on Choice, top end being a very selective burn, as opposed to some of the other choices that the Kurumi Standby top end can do. The Choice top end allows you to be able to selectively burn your opponent to deal enough damage and precise damage to close out that game that way through damage alone, whereas the Standby allows you to fluctuate and mess with your opponent's deck state a little bit more easily.
Yeah, so with 3 top contenders, 2 of which are like right in that running to be regional winners, and another one that at least is threatening to top, Data Live is something that we're going to see a lot of. And anytime you see it, if you see a choice or a standby trigger, you know that you're playing into something that's really powerful. So Data Live will continue to be dangerous going into 2022 and beyond. So moving from a deck that's at the top of the meta to a deck that is definitely not at the top of the meta anymore, Let's talk about Fate. Fate was one of the best decks in the meta for a long time. The 8-bar list didn't really have any response to it for quite a while. But in 2022, Fate is facing a different kind of meta. It has a couple of different lists it can try to run, most of which now are dependent on the salvage top end, the Dark Sakura top end, that basically pays for its own Icy Tail with its combo effect. It's a solid top end, but Fate's biggest question mark is definitely at level 1 now. You have a couple of options at level 1. You can run the old green Sakura level 1 combo, which is an on reverse plus, and it also opens up your ability to use the 1/1 stock swap green event, which requires green characters on board. So while there's some synergy with the early game, still requiring a reverse at level 1 is a difficult thing to ask for in a standby meta in 2022. It's something that could be more easily denied than in previous metas, and its bombs don't deal with 1/1 standby targets. So a lot of the old early game Fate package is not very well positioned right now. You can try to pivot to some of the newer stuff. The best one at this point is probably the Pants trigger, because that combo is on attack, lets you top check 4, add 1. It's on a Pants trigger, which can help set up the level 3 combo, and it also helps you mill, so you can get through the deck faster and hopefully get to a better compression state before you can get to your compression tools later in the game. But still, Fate is just not that well positioned right now because it's so small at level 1. Its level 3 combo is competent but not explosive, and as much as it can, fix its own deck state with, refresh effects like the 2/1 free refresh that you play out of hand or the 1/0 free refresh event, it doesn't have really good matchups against a lot of the stuff that's at the top of the meta, yet a lot of people still really like it, and bar salvage is ranked 10th in the community tier list, Brandon.
It struggles a little bit going into standby, especially at level 1, but in many ways it also deals with everything else beneath it quite well. It deals pretty well with 1k1 decks. It deals pretty well with decks that aren't putting massive costed bodies on field right away, because it can kind of tier up against some of those pretty effectively and then be able to generate those resources that way. It does have a little bit of a filter engine going on with that, so you have a little bit of that reoccurrence of a level 1 combo and having that potential to threaten that combo over and over again to set up your end game, right? Going into that closing turn of being able to rip through your opponent's deck to completely change up what their deck looks like in order to swing into that new deck.
So it will do fine, I think, in Swiss, and as long as it doesn't run into bad matchups, it could top, but I think it's going to have a really hard time when it gets into kind of the upper echelons of the most powerful stuff, because it really can't play into Dal at all. There's just too much at the top that it's going to struggle to beat on board, and it's just going to bleed resources out of hand the entire game. Kind of on that next step down from this list is the 8 salvage list, which again kind of has the same problems as the other 1k1 Fate lists, except it also doesn't have a way to really get its level 3 combo together with the climax. There's no climax swap. So if you're playing 8 salvage, you're really stuck trying to dig for climaxes and using these really expensive effects to hope that you can draw into it. It's also just not very big. It's also a non-selective level 1 combo. So this list feels a lot like the bar salvage or the pants salvage lists, but with a significant step down at level 1, just because it's not running as useful of a trigger in this matchup, or it just doesn't have as much synergy with the level 1 as, say, like the green stuff, because it all works pretty nicely together.
With the salvage combo, you're more likely to grab zeros because of the effect itself. Fate zeros are pretty good, but you're going to struggle against power lines against bigger decks. Fate zeros aren't going to match up against standby targets, especially playing into a deck that benefits from getting the reverses of those zeros. Is going to be much more challenging to get the pieces you need in that salvage list to maintain the game going forward. You have a lot more access to red, you have access to blue pretty effectively. It becomes a challenge moving forward with that deck.
But the other Fate list, the one that, has been the most common for years, is the 8-bar list, which runs a completely different top end. It runs the Neg Soul top end with the Rider, and I gotta be honest, this is not meta anymore. I know there are a lot of people who like this list, and it's not a bad deck, and if you want to take it, by all means take it. If you like playing it, if you bought it, if you've played it, by all means do so. But we can't pretend that this is meta anymore. The bar top end just gets shredded by anything with Blink, and way too much stuff has Blink. So those Neg Soul effects don't happen anymore in a lot of matchups, especially against Data Live, because every Data Live list is running that Blink Shido that just destroys this entire effect. Neg Soul top ends just aren't effective in 2022, which is why you just don't see them. I think this is the only Neg Soul top end that we're going to talk about, and honestly, we're talking about it because it's Fate and it has a reputation, as opposed to it being particularly relevant in competition. It did not top at Springfest. It will not top at Rumble.
Looking at the 8-bar list, I think you really nailed the idea with the top end. The Neg Soul is much more easily answered with a lot of the newer decks that have come out with different types of removal, whether through Blink, whether through Bounce, whether through other kinds of things like that. You have a lot of answers to that already. So the Neg Soul top end is really good against decks that haven't faced off against that or don't have those tech pieces available to it. But as more and more decks have those tools readily available, it becomes tougher to pull that off as a part of the finishing endgame. It's good for some matchups and it can shut off certain endgames, but it's also very weak to others.
Moving on to Fate Grand Order, Standby Door, it is another one of those decks that just kind of barely crept into the community tier list. The top end is an expensive burn 4, and it doesn't have enough standby synergy to really make the most of its 4 standby triggers. Decks that only run 4 standby triggers are at such a disadvantage in this meta because you really have to hit standby or slam standby as much as you can when you play standby, and only having access to 4 triggers, it really makes it hard.
Yeah, pretty much. It doesn't have enough standby to really play into the standby game as effectively as it wants to. But on the flip side, the top end is also very expensive, so it needs to build up those resources throughout the game. But if it can't play into the standby early, it needs to figure out another way to build resources.
Goblin Slayer, Standby Salvage. I'm going to be honest, Goblin Slayer is really scary when Vince pilots it, and basically is not very scary when anybody else does. It doesn't have a closing top end. That's always been the knock on Goblin Slayer, and it didn't get a meta of its own. When it came out, was right when the pandemic was starting, so we didn't really get to see it shine in a meta where people could not deny it. Now we have the pieces to really deny Goblin Slayer, or just to beat over it and stick enough damage to win, regardless of its healing effects.
The back row damage scry engine is probably one of the strongest things it has going for it, along with the additional ways to heal, and just playing into the heals.
So here we go, Brandon. This is the biggest addition to the meta since Springfest. Kaguya, Standby Salvage. It comes in at number 1 on the community tier list. We talked about this deck at length in our last video. We talked about all of its matchups. I think that 1 is a bit aggressive for this. As much as I do think this is a good deck, and a relevant deck, and something that could absolutely win a regional, I don't think it's the best deck here. Mostly because I don't think it handles the standby matchup as well as it needs to. And it's going to be playing into a lot of standby. It has a level 3 combo that's basically like a refurbished Mikasa from AOT. It has a couple of burns. It does require a reverse for one of them. Its level 1 combo is tiny and requires a reverse. I feel like that's pretty deniable. It has a ton of wonderful synergistic effects. It really loves to use that drop searcher for so many different things, which is honestly very cool. It has the 3-2 President that comes down as an early play. It can't be backed up, and it's just massive, and it can clock kick annoying things. So it has great tools, and it works. It plays really nicely with its own pieces. But I feel like Data Live has just enough to, in this matchup, deal with Kaguya on board well enough to claim the advantage in that matchup.
Realistically, Kaguya has a lot of different pieces that help deal with Standby. However, I think, and I agree, that its matchup with Data Live is rougher. This is the matchup we're going to need paying close attention to throughout this tournament, because I think this is going to be one of the biggest matchups to help decide some of those top tables.
Yeah, I think that there will probably be a region that is decided by Data Live versus Kaguya. And against a lot of other things, Kaguya is quite strong.
Kaguya has a lot of pieces. It has a strong power threshold, especially at level 1, to be able to deal with a lot of different things for very inexpensive means.
Yeah, I think that Kaguya might be the most efficient deck in the entire meta. Not only does Kaguya use its resources cheaply, it also can use them for multiple things. That Drop Searcher comes down and then comes back granting power, right? Like, and it feels like Kaguya has all these pieces that work together so well. It dominates a lot of 1k1 matchups, right? Because it can get its level 1 combo to power thresholds that let it beat over and get its reverses. And it doesn't even need to get reverses in a bunch of lanes, right? Because it already has such strong combo-less advantage engines throughout its mid game, so it doesn't really need to get like a full board of its combo. It does so well gaining and then managing those resources that it can basically just out-resource you through most of the game if you're playing against it with a 1k1 deck. It does have, a couple of challenges. It doesn't play great defense. It can be removed from board pretty easily by big things. It does require a reverse for its extra burn at level 3, so its top end isn't quite as explosive. If you can deny those reverses, which a lot of, big standby boards can do, at least in, some lanes, so it's not getting multiple instances of those extra burns. Kaguya is really strong, and it's really good. This is its first real test, right? Because it hasn't been in this level of competitive environment. There are a lot of people singing its praises. It deserves a lot of those praises. I'm very interested to see how it will stack up when a bunch of people are playing it through an entire set of tournaments over a full weekend. Moving on. Remember when KonoSuba was really good? It's still fun, but it is definitely less good now. It plays 2 different variants. There's basically the old KonoSuba stuff and the new KonoSuba stuff. The old stuff is still running the Bunny Girl Union at level 1, oftentimes, and it will run the top end, which has the Mega Mean Burn engine. It clock kicks and tries to burn for 4.
Yeah, if you still had the pieces parts from KonoSuba from before Legend of Crimson came out, there's still a lot of things that work well with that. And there's a reason that it was in the place that it was several years ago. It's been a while. It doesn't get the same reverses. It has power struggles across the board. It has a lot of weaknesses that are much more easily exploited. And so it has a lot of struggles as it gets towards its endgame.
The primary challenge for any KonoSuba deck right now is usually its level 1 game. Its level 3 game hasn't changed, right? In any iteration of KonoSuba, you're trying to decompress your opponent and stick them for massive damage. That's what you do. That's just what KonoSuba does. It just tries to blow the opponent out of the water with massive swings in the decompressed deck. It plays that Aqua Fumio, the old stuff in particular plays that Aqua Fumio, where you drop it on board and you pull 2 climaxes basically out of your opponent's deck, right? Like, that's what it does. And it's really effective at that. That's why it did so well for so long, is because there just weren't really tools to deal with that kind of rapid decompression. Now, we have things that can help with that. We have refresh counters that can put those climaxes back into deck. We have decks that, can do a lot more of the damage scrying, right? The clock kicks are still viable, but the big burns are not so viable. And that's if you can pull it off. They're still very expensive. They're, big effects. You have to pay to get the cards on board. You have to pay to, do the burn effect. And you aren't getting the damage from the swings because you're just resting your cards. So if you don't close, you don't really have much of a turn coming back the other way. And like you said, the Bunny Girl Union, which exists to try to build up some of that stock and some of those cards in hand to make it happen, it doesn't get the reverses that it needs. Enter new KonoSuba, which doesn't usually require reverses. It used to play the salvage Megumin combo at level 1, but people really dropped that in favor of the Pants Aqua. You'll see a lot of stuff that plays 5 salvage 3 Pants. That's typically the construction now. That Aqua combo tries to, get enough cards in the hand so that KonoSuba can have its resources together so it can throw down that big combo, which is very similar to the old one because it, decompresses, it rests, it clock kicks, it burns. It's an expensive combo still, though. It's still a very expensive combo to try to pull off, and it isn't super consistent. It has opportunities, right? But it's not as consistent as it needs to be at closing a game. If you're going to commit this many resources to an endgame, it has to close from 3-0, and KonoSuba, frankly, just doesn't do that enough. And also, if you are playing into KonoSuba, if you see one top end, it doesn't necessarily mean that's the level 1 you're playing into, right? Like, you can play the new Aqua with the old Megumin top end. Like, that's definitely a viable play. KonoSuba kind of ranks in the middle of the community tier list. It ranked 12th and 15th, respectively, between 5-door 3 Pants and the Stocksoul Salvage. So...
feels a little high, but...
yeah, I'm going to be honest, it does. But it's popular still, right? Like, people still have it. And I think a lot of people are still, a little bit snake bit by, getting Aqua Fumio'd into a burn 4 Megumin. Or even worse, the off Megumin that burned for 5. Like, people have bad experiences with those cards. So, and anything that can burn you to death while you're still in level 2 is just uniquely terrifying. So, KonoSuba is always going to be at least a little bit relevant just because it has a potentially explosive top end, if an inconsistent one. Next, Love Live Sunshine. We talked about this extensively in the last video. Usually plays the Stocksoul combo on the level 1 bombs into an empty salvage. Its top end is basically just spamming Yo burns and using Chica to get Yo on board as much as possible. Whenever Yo attacks, you mill a card and you burn X equal to the level of that card, and you play a crap ton of level 3s to make sure you get as many burns off as possible. That's the deck. It's what it does. It's very effective at what it does because it basically attacks 4 times a turn once it hits 2-0. And that's hard to deal with.
Especially when you can kind of set your first trigger, so you can kind of set that first burn. Like, you're able to kind of almost guarantee what kind of how much damage you're dealing initially, so you can kind of set up your opponent to be in certain situations. It allows you to be able to just kind of spam that burn to get to the win. And I think that has a lot of pull still in this meta, to be able to just kind of continually add additional damages each turn, starting from 2. To make it an effective additional swing every turn, I think makes it a very powerful deck still with where we're at.
I think Love Live Sunshine is basically like the idealized version of what Adventure Time and KonoSuba try to be, which is just this explosive top end that is just trying to get to its top end as quickly as possible so it can swing as much as possible. And Love Live Sunshine is just so dangerous because it's so easy to get the entire package on board at level 2. That's what makes it dangerous. And then it has stuff that lets it keep it on board as well. If you don't have a memory counter, Love Live Sunshine can really, really hurt you. And it's probably the best of the damage rush decks that we're going to see. And that's honestly one of the few things that Standby's kind of weak against. If you can just pour a bunch of damage onto a Standby deck that is more concerned about building up its board than getting its compression together, Love Live can really do a lot of damage in those kinds of spaces. Next, we have Magia Record. Couple of different ways to build this. They all use the level 1 choice combo. Some of them use the level 3 choice combo. Some of them use level 3 salvage. Level 1 combo is on reverse, plussing. It gets nice and big, but it's still an on reverse combo. Basically, it's a 1k1 deck. It runs 8 plussing triggers. It's another one of those kind of old style decks that feels a little bit behind the times in a contemporary meta because it just doesn't have ways to deal with big boards.
Yeah, pretty much just trying to generate the resources through its triggers and trying to consistently push damage to help survive the games. It focuses a little bit on healing, trying to kind of stay alive longer.
It also can work to fix its own deck states to a certain extent. Like, it does have refresh pieces that can help to stabilize it if it gets in a bad deck state, but as much as that's useful, it needs a little bit more to really be able to survive against some of these really high-powered decks that can deal a lot of damage while also winning a lot of board. So here's one I don't think anyone expected to see. We're going to talk a little bit about Persona 5. Why are we talking about Persona 5? Well, because it's uniquely well-positioned right now. I don't expect to see this at Rumble at all. I don't think we're going to see any Persona 5 at any major tournament probably for the rest of time. But if you want to play Persona 5, this is as good of a meta as you could play it in as there has been for a while. Persona has the ability to get pretty big at level 1, especially on defense, right? It sits at 7-5 usually in its front row, and you can have the counter in hand that'll bump it up to 10,000 at level 1, which can deal with a lot of standby targets, and its level 3 Joker combo, which whenever your opponent's board is completely reversed or empty, it burns equal to the level of the card you reveal off the top of deck 3 times, assuming you have a full board, is useful because it has ways to remove things from board. It can either get really big itself to clear a lane by getting a reverse, or it plays the Stock Soul combo at the top that when you slam it down, you can pitch a card, and you can bounce an opponent's character back into their hand. So as long as you're not playing into something that has hexproof, this isn't terrible. Playing into standby. At level 1 and at level 3, it has the power necessary to really contest standby boards, and there are ways to continue to get that power pumped. There are on-attack power pumps, there's consistent back row power pump, and it also runs a wind trigger. It has a level 2 combo that comes down early at level 1 with a full board that sits at 7-5 with the back row, and swings at 8-5 with the wind, that it needs a reverse, but you can usually find one lane that you can reverse, even in standby matchups, oftentimes, in the middle of the game. But that wind trigger can also help deal with big stuff on board that other decks don't necessarily have answers for. So the fact that it gets pretty big on its own, combined with a pretty effective, level 3 board clearing, burning combo, and the fact that it has a wind trigger to boot, means it can play into standby better than a lot of other stuff. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is, high meta stuff, nor do, again, I expect to see it at all, because I just don't think anyone's going to play it. But if you've got it, this isn't a bad tournament to bring Persona to.
I think it's going to be really interesting to see, because it really comes into that top end, right? It comes into, can you clear the top end of some of these decks across the board completely to be able to get your reverses? And I mean, you have a lot of removal possibilities, so you have a lot of ways to remove things or decrease power in different ways, depending on what you target. So you have potential to be able to do that. I think it's really going to come down to what resources your opponent has available at the end of the game. I think it's going to depend on how long the game stalls out and how often you can compete in that mid-game. Especially if you're going into a bunch of standby, how well Persona deals that level 2 mid-game, I think is going to be a big factor in this.
Moving on to Quintuplets. This is a new set that we haven't seen in tournaments yet. It came in ranked number 8 in the community tier list. We're looking at bar choice. The level 1 bar combo seems to be kind of what everyone wants to play in Quintuplets, into a level 3 cancel burn choice combo. Quintuplets seems to have something here. Brandon, I wasn't sure what Quintuplets was going to really bring to the table when it first dropped, but this deck seems to have kind of come together pretty nicely, and it looks like it has a real chance to do something.
The top end is very explosive, and it has a lot of damage potential. Being able to effectively try to push damage at the top makes this deck very appealing, because you are very likely to close if you can have the resources to triple combo this top end. On the flip side of that, getting there is half the battle. Your level 1 combos are going to be on the smaller side, but having some of those tools and resources to manage your resources and salvage as much resources as possible into your endgame really is kind of what makes the deal here. Having triggers that help benefit stock make a difference here. Having triggers that help benefit hand make a difference here. So whether you're running bar choice or maybe even 8 choice, you have options of where cards are going. So you can help fill the gap as you're growing through, whether in hand or whether it's on field, to generate the resources necessary to be able to close out that game.
Bunny Girl Senpai. This was not listed in the community tier list. And honestly, for good reason. It's not very good anymore. It was pretty good for a minute early in its lifespan, but the meta's really moved past it in a lot of ways. It was taken to Springfest 5 times and none of those topped. It tries to play great performance, which in 2022 is just not really that viable. It doesn't get super big. It's a relatively easy body card to deal with by comparison. And its finishing combos just aren't particularly strong. It's a defensive deck from an era where defensive decks didn't need to be as big as they do now. So it's just honestly outclassed by contemporary big stuff.
It has some interesting play at level 1 with the level 1 bombs that help bring things in, that can try to help answer some of those 1/1 targets that are brought in pretty early. However, the standbys that it bring in feel almost a turn too late. And so it feels like it needs more standby in order to be able to compete at the level where it needs to.
Yeah, this is definitely another deck that suffers from only having 4 standby triggers. Next, we're looking at RWBY. Now, RWBY is a little bit different just because it's new. So there's still a lot that's kind of being, sorted out about it, especially because it's an English exclusive. So there isn't like a Japanese meta that could have helped define what this was going to look like. Based on what people seem to be doing with it, it looks like 8 standby is going to be the most popular build in RWBY, which, is pretty competent. RWBY's not bad. It has 8 standby triggers. It has plenty of standby targets and 2 standby combos at level 3 that can 1 decompress and then 2 burn your opponent for big damage. So it's got really nice synergy. It's got some good pieces. It's got plenty of top check. It's, really dependent on hitting those triggers. But RWBY 8 standby, it's pretty capable. I would put it kind of in the mid tier of all of like those 8 standby lists. I think RWBY's kind of right in the middle.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be one of the most interesting decks to be present at Rumble because you don't have a lot of that testing time between RWBY fully coming out and the tournament scene. So you're not going to have as much experience playing into some of those matchups, or your opponent's not going to have as much experience playing it. So it's going to be really interesting to see if RWBY can be piloted effectively and brought into that high tier, or whether we see RWBY kind of struggle on the outside, suffering from the fact that it only just recently came out.
And RWBY also has a bunch of, 1k1 builds that you can see. There's the trial deck salvage combo. Sometimes you'll see the yellow stuff get run in addition to the Pyrrha combo at the top, or, completely different top ends, even with lots of different triggers and lots of different off finishers in this set. So RWBY is not a monolith by any extent. Not sure necessarily what the dominant builds are going to be, so we're just going to kind of leave it at this. It came in 17th on the community tier list. We'll see what happens. There will be more to say after the tournament than before. Moving on to ReZero. My, how the mighty have fallen. We definitely thought that ReZero was going to be a really powerful deck at Springfest. It turned out, honestly, not to be. There were 12 ReZero decks that showed up, only one of which got a top 8. It plays the old Emilia book combo into this bar top end that does burn damage, basically, if it gets a reverse or if that space it's swinging into is open. So it's perfectly competent. It's perfectly capable. It's the platonic ideal of a 1k1 deck, except its triggers aren't very good. It runs book, which you would love to see that be a pants trigger, but when that Emilia combo came out, level 1 blue was almost always book. And its top end is on bar, which has some support, but that support feels really inconsistent in Frozen Bond. It's almost there. It's really close, but it's just far enough off that it doesn't have what it needs to consistently get where it needs to go. And on top of that, it doesn't get big enough offensively to deal with standby boards.
Yeah, it really struggled against the standby that we saw with Data Live in the previous Springfest. It really struggled with a lot of the top decks. And I think that that's going to be its issue going forward, is that some of those top decks can challenge it and hold it at bay. It just doesn't generate enough resources to be able to make some of the new pieces worth it, especially when it's consistently losing its board.
Next, Seven Deadly Sins. It almost always plays the choice top end. Sometimes you'll see, different level 1 stuff, either salvage or choice, but the level 3 top end is almost always this choice combo. With the back row, it basically hexproofs itself, prevents it from taking auto damage, and when it is attacked, can burn 2 to the opponent. Really solid, honestly, in principle, and it has good synergy with itself. The problem is there are just too many things that can deal with this kind of setup in the current meta.
Yeah, like Seven Deadly Sins has a lot of pieces that are really good, but don't synergize very well. With that in mind, looking at the top end, his one being more defensive, is going to have that same kind of struggle that we see with Fate. Defensive top ends are facing an uphill battle because there's so much different removal tech to be able to deny those cross-turn effects.
So now we get to one of the most interesting sets in the entire English Weiss world, one that has been a big part of English Weiss basically since it dropped and has not gone away. We're talking about Sword Art Online. There are 3 different decks that made the community tier list. However, there are also a couple other SAO decks that have the potential to be present and significant at Rumble. Sword Art as a set sent 3 decks to top 8 out of 14 in Springfest, so it's certainly at least relevant, but the meta has not been particularly kind to Sword Art. The most interesting Sword Art list right now is probably the pants list. It came in at 19th, the 6 pants 2 stock soul build, although you can also see this with just 8 pants. There are a couple different ways to build this, but by and large, this deck is trying to get its level 1 combo together. This is like the base level 1 Alicization combo on attack plussing if you have experience. And its top end is an Icy Tail combo also on pants. Brandon, you're the channel's resident Sword Art player. Help me unpack everything that's going on here.
There's a lot of different potential, a lot of different opportunities for these decks to highlight different things. Majority of them using the pants level 1 combo because there's a lot of support with that, along with the pants assist, to be able to have a decent mid game to try to continue to generate resources off the combo to get the pieces for the end game, get your end game pieces set up. The end games are really where it kind of comes down to. And the reason it's kind of more diverse is because they do different things. So they answer different situations. So having the different top ends in different smaller local metas makes more sense. Like with the pants top end having the Icy Tails along with the event to burn additional damage selectively beforehand, you're able to kind of hone in on that precise damage and deal with your opponent's deck states, especially as they're more compressed, to get that damage in. Similarly, we see that with the choice combo as well, trying to affect compressed decks by more minimizing the amount of damage that it deals through size, shrinking it down to burn 1s. But you're also then milling through your own deck, so you have to kind of watch out for your own deck speed and making sure you have the climaxes in your own deck to effectively deal burns.
Yeah, that choice combo mills 11 and burns 1 for each climax milled in increments of 1. So really powerful potential top end, but like you said, it mills yourself.
Looking at the wind, you have that possibility of going into, especially a standby heavy meta, wind being pretty effective to bounce standby targets back to hand, forcing your opponents to play it through stock or some other means. So if you're really messing with standby at that point, but at the same time, some of those power thresholds are a little bit on the smaller side, so you're dependent on the triggering.
Right, and that's, always the challenge with anything that depends heavily on hitting its triggers, especially if hitting your triggers is how you play defense. 8 wind is interesting because wind is not directly a plussing trigger, right? So it helps you in the standby matchup, but it definitely doesn't help you as much in a lot of your other matchups. The first half of the game against a 1k1 deck, your wind trigger really doesn't help you at all other than to push more damage. So still, it has a very capable top end that does extra burn damage, can close from 3-0, so you love to see that. And like you said, that wind trigger is really useful in this contemporary meta. Going into standby stuff, if you can hit a couple of those triggers, really disrupt what your opponent wants to do on board, you can create windows for yourself to do the kind of damage you need to win games. Outside of Alicization, there are still a couple of older Sword Art lists that are relevant as well. 8 standby list is almost all old stuff, doesn't even play like the standby combos. Basically, it's just trying to get big on board by slamming climaxes, getting 2/2s, and then getting, its level 3 targets on board as quickly as possible. Basically, just to use off finishers to try to close. It's not as sophisticated as a lot of the contemporary 8 standby builds because Sword Art really wasn't built for standby. There's just not a lot of great synergy there.
It's only because of Alicization that you get your second standby trigger to be able to make 8 standby a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
So having a lot of pieces parts that we had from that kind of standby X, where the top end was going to be along the side of that standby, typically standby pants, you now have opportunities to be able to start pushing some of these bigger standby targets that you didn't have before with more consistency. With that, you have a lot of potential power, a lot of floating power with some of these counters to be able to match up against your opponent defensively. So it makes it a real defensive deck, but because it's a more defensive deck, it lacks some of the offensive power needed to close out a game. The flip side of that, looking at the classic Zekken last shot builds, these really hone in on the offensive power at the end, but the power lines are very small throughout the game, so you're really just trying to get to that end game to then burn your opponent out.
Oh yeah, last shot is, entirely devoted to making its massive burns at the end go off. And again, in a meta where players can control their deck compression states much better than they used to be able to, this is less useful, but that Zekken combo is still pretty powerful, still, can plus you quite efficiently. It's still relevant. It's not on the community tier list. If you run into it, know that it can, it can still do some damage. It can still beat you just by virtue of having a high damage ceiling. And there's so much Sword Art stuff, right? I mean, shoot, there's Link Strike you could see. There's the new administrator stuff that you could see. There's all kinds of Sword Art. There's so much of it. So just, if you're playing into Sword Art, see what triggers are going into Waiting Room. See what cards are finding their way into zones where you can see them so that you can get an idea of what you're trying to play into. Because all of these different Sword Art lists, unfortunately for people playing into them, are different enough that you need to be aware of what all of them do. Because playing into each of them is a completely different battle. And then finally, we have one more set to talk about, and it's a really good set because it's Slime. And Slime is currently ranked 4, 5, 6 in the community tier list, and we want to start with 8 Standby. Brandon, you and I think that 8 Standby Slime is one of the most powerful decks in the meta. It runs the level 1 combo that basically lets you Twin Drive to try to get more Standby triggers off so you can get your 2/2 Gelds onto the board that you can then sacrifice to give something else 4,000 power on defense. Basically just destroy your opponent's board. They can't win board against you basically at all. You're going to keep putting power on board with standby triggers until you get to your level 3 game, which uses an event to try to burn you and can hurt you either by getting a reverse or by swinging in.
Yeah, I think the 2/2 Geld here is the big key, because it has the ability to send itself to Waiting Room to grant 4,000 power to something. But because it goes to Waiting Room, you can encore it back to field. So you have the threat of 4K power pump in every lane, effectively, if you just have one Geld on board. And that's not including counters, right? Because you can add a counter on top of that. So as soon as you hit level 2, you have this threat range of like, oh, I can now throw 7,000 power in a single lane to be able to deny reverses in something. This deck here is like the highlighting issue of, hey, you need to be able to reach certain offensive thresholds or else you're not getting reverse. Slime here is like the answer saying, yeah, you're not getting reverses, period.
Yeah, anything that needs a reverse, if you're playing into Slime, you're going to struggle to get that reverse. Because it can just deny it pretty easily. And not only deny it, but have the stock, because of its combo, to bring it back on board and not miss it. So, really powerful stuff on board, and a capable finishing combo that can close games. A couple other slime builds as well. The 8 choice build is also new in the new set. It has a top end that basically restands itself, but it's a little more sophisticated than that. Basically, it replaces itself on board so that you can swing again with another copy of itself. Basically just tries to swing and swing and swing and swing as much as possible until the opponent dies, and that's one of the reasons why it plays 8 choice triggers, because it needs a lot of stock to pull this endgame off.
Well, that and when it's going through its endgame, triggering choice along the way can help continue to make the thing oppressive, so you do not need as much resources on the top end to start off the combo, but rather you can build those resources during the attacks themselves to make it so you get to this very oppressive endgame scenario. 8 choice really just trying to survive to the endgame and then destroy you from the endgame out.
And then, of course, there's one more. There's the Pants Salvage, which we saw at Springfest. It was the second most represented deck at that tournament. It only got 2 top 8s out of 18 decks. It focuses on healing and compressing itself by sending as many cards to memory basically as it can so that it doesn't take damage. Compression is always going to be viable, just because if you can't stick damage, you can't win. So this is always going to be at least relevant, but its top end certainly pales in comparison to what contemporary Slime is doing.
Absolutely, especially with the choice end being on play heal. So every time that a combo spawns itself on field heals again, it can heal back down to 3-0 relatively effectively, which becomes a little bit more desirable beyond this kind of Pants Salvage list. Pants Salvage list, you have the essentially free memory with Shizu. As long as it reveals the top, it can potentially go to memory. Ramorous to come in and guarantee things to memory. You have a lot of memory compression in that deck, whereas the other two focus more on stock or board presence.
Okay, so we've made it through all the decks. That's a lot of decks. Here's the tier list. So the way we decided to organize this list was by asking ourselves a series of questions. Basically, if the deck that we're looking at had an average share of the meta at this event, would we be surprised if it didn't win? Would we be surprised if it did win? Would we expect it to top? Would we expect it not to top? And we just kind of went down the line, and whatever we decided our expectation for that deck was, that was the tier that we put it on. We think that this defines more specifically what we mean when we say that a deck is on a certain tier. So for example, the first question we asked was, would we be shocked if this deck did not win one of the 3 regionals? And the only deck that garnered that kind of response from us was Data Live 8 Standby. We would both be very surprised if it did not win one of the 3 tournaments at Rumble. On that next tier down, we have 3 decks that it wouldn't surprise us if it won, but if it didn't win, we also wouldn't necessarily be surprised. These are decks that could be considered favored to win. It's a likely outcome that they win one of the 3 regionals, and that's the Kaguya Standby Salvage deck, the Slime 8 Standby deck, and Data Live Choice Standby. All these still very powerful. They all have disadvantages in the DAO matchup specifically, and I think that's the thing that really sets apart Data Live. Data Live has answers to all 3 of these, one way or another. Against Kaguya, it can answer the early play President with the Yoshino Bomb. It can handle Slime because it can kind of win board early. Slime doesn't really get the 1/1s on board, so DAO can establish board early and, can deal with the Gelds on board as well if they get dropped into the front row with that Yoshino again. And then against DAO Choice Standby, again, it's about board. Choice can get its pluses at level 1, but DAO can win so much board that the choice list is forced to use more resources. And again, in all 3 of these matchups, even though they all have standby, only 8 Standby has the full damage scry engine where if it gets a reverse, especially on defense, it can scry down and keep that damage from sticking. So Dal has an advantage in the matchups here at the top, which is kind of why I think we decided to put Dal on its own tier.
Yeah, we're very confident on some of these top ones here, looking at recognizing the potential that these ones have is going to put them in some of these top spots.
So with Love Live Sunshine, we determined that we would be surprised if it won. We really would be surprised if it won, but we wouldn't be surprised if it topped. In fact, we would be surprised if, assuming an equal meta share, it didn't top. We expect that if people bring Love Live Sunshine, it will go top 8. 7 people brought Sunshine to Springfest, and it got 2 top 8s. The meta hasn't necessarily shifted in its favor, but it hasn't gotten that much more hostile towards Sunshine either. And most decks aren't necessarily playing the stuff that can particularly counter Sunshine. So if Sunshine is decently well represented, we expect it to top again, but we don't necessarily expect it to win. So now this is where it starts to get a little hairy, right? The top 5 decks are ostensibly our favorites, right? They're the ones that we expect are going to do well, would probably top, assuming that they have, an average meta share. But now we're getting into the stuff where it's like, okay, will this top? I don't know. It's a harder choice to make. So we had to come down on it one way or another, so we posed this question. If someone gave you $1 and you had to bet that dollar on this deck either topping or not topping, what would you bet on? If you were to put $1 on this, if you had to, would you bet that it would top or that it wouldn't top? And that's how we divided the next 18 decks that we have. Because none of these were good enough to garner shock if they did not top. But we also wouldn't necessarily be shocked if they did. These are like kind of the outside looking in, right? These are all good decks. They're capable, but they're not favorites. So we asked the question, if you had to bet $1, would you bet that dollar on this deck getting a top or not getting a top? And the ones that we said we would say that they would get a top were 8 Choice Stayed Alive, Bar Salvage Fate, Magia Record with a Choice Level 1, Persona 5, Quintuplets Bar Choice, RWBY 8 Standby, Sword Art Pants, Slime 8 Choice, and Slime Pants Salvage. This is an eclectic group, and again, this is assuming that these all have average meta representation, which they will not. Again, Persona 5, probably not going to be played at all. Magia Record, honestly, I would be surprised if there were more than a couple of those running around. But these are decks that, for whatever reason, are decently well positioned in the meta, for the reasons that we talked about earlier, that can do something. Also, we listed these in alphabetical order. So, like, that we're not saying that, Dal 8 Choice is so much better than, Slime 8 Choice. We're not really making value judgment there, because this is where it gets really fluid and you're really splitting hairs when you try to, go down a tier list like this. And I know that the one that's going to surprise people is Persona 5. I know that that is going to surprise some people and potentially bug some people. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that it's in the same tier as something like Quintuplets or, Pants Sword Art. It feels like it's kind of in that same kind of tier, kind of on the outside looking in, but still quite competent.
With that, on the flip side, we looked at these 9 decks and looked at these ones saying that we expect these not to top. If we had to bet $1, we would bet $1 that these would not top. Going in with the AOT, the Bofuri 2 Soul, followed up by Bofuri Standby. Recognizing, some of those decks did top in Springfest, that we would not expect them to top this time around.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest, not being able to put 2 Soul Bofuri in the expect to top category hurts my soul just a little bit, because I want it to so bad, but I don't think it's going to quite get there. And also, just to differentiate, you see 3 different fates on here. The fate that we expect to top is specifically the level 1 green or the level 1 blue into the salvage top end, whereas the one we expect not to top is the 8 salvage list. So the green level 1 into the soccer top end. We felt like there was enough of a difference there to put them on different tiers. Yeah, these are the ones where, like, if they did, we wouldn't be stunned. Like, if ReZero found a top, right? Like it did in Springfest. It went 1 for 12 in Springfest. It wouldn't really be a huge stunner, right? If Attack on Titan got a top, which it did in Springfest, 1 out of 8, wouldn't surprise us. Like, these are decks that, we're asking the question, can they win 4 out of 6 or 5 out of 7 in Swiss? Yeah, they can. I wouldn't necessarily expect them to, but it's possible. I would say they're more likely not to than to win those games, but it's certainly doable. And that's what this tier is for. So if you're bringing these, you're an underdog for sure. You're definitely on the outside, but like, it's possible. We're not, trying to, rain on your parade here. And then finally, we talk about the decks that we would be shocked if they topped. And we have 2 Adventure Time lists here. We have the Bang Dream list, 8-bar Fate, that's 8 bar specifically, Fate Grand Order, both of the KonoSuba lists, Bunny Girl, Last Shot Sword Art, and then 7 Deadly Sins 8 choice. Adventure Time's really fallen, right? At least in our opinion. Like, it's still ranked pretty highly in the community tier list. It's still ranked, I believe, 9th. The problem is, it had 16 chances to top at Springfest and it only got 1 top. As much as it has a really solid top end, a top end alone isn't typically enough to go X2 because it really is going to lose board in the middle of the game, especially against all these standby lists at the top. Like, if you look at the top of the meta, in the top 5 decks, the top 4 all play at least 4 standby triggers. And then if you're looking kind of in those next couple of tiers, there's still more standby with Sword Art and with RWBY and with Bofuri. It's just going to run into too many big boards, I think, to really be able to get its resources together to consistently be able to close the way that it wants to. It'll get some wins that way, but it's going to fall behind in a lot of matchups. And, some of these, like KonoSuba, kind of the same thing. Like, it has these big explosive top ends, but its mid-game just really struggles to keep pace. 8-bar Fate is, its top end is the only top end of its kind, even in this entire graphic, in terms of, neg soul top ends, and that can get shut off too easily. These are decks that, like, if you're bringing it, this is not a knock on you or your character. It's, be aware that these are not in a good position to do well at this tournament. They have too many bad matchups to really be considered meta viable. Be aware of that as you go in. That's what this is for. This also necessarily isn't, like, we're not ranking these 1 through 33 either. Like, I don't think that's necessarily the way that this is meant to be interpreted.
Within each of these tiers, the decks are minuscule differences between them. So we didn't want to rate those as nitpicky as we could have. Whereas we think there is a significant difference between kind of the last tier and the top tier. The in-between tiers, like as you go in between, the differences are very minute. And it was more, and even then, the middle 18 between expected to top and expected not to top, realistically, it's really more of our opinion. Whereas we thought those were really all on the same tier, but the tier was too big, and we wanted to shrink that down and consolidate it a little bit more in order to really emphasize what we were talking about.
Yeah, and this is also, like, as much as it feels like this is every possible deck in Weiss, there are dozens that we did not talk about. Some of which will get played, Like, there's stuff that got played at Springfest that no one thought was going to see any play.
Shout out to the Batman Ninja.
Exactly, and to that point, there's stuff that people are going to play that will do better than people expect. There is very likely a shock top here that isn't in this graphic. It's definitely possible. Like, it's happened before, will probably happen again. So, the meta is shaken by events like this. We haven't had a major event in several months, so we're trying to piece together something based on, reading these cards and gauging their interactions and a whole lot of playtesting to try to see where we're at and try to see how these play into each other. So something on this list could definitely top that we said wouldn't. Something on this list could definitely crash and burn that we thought was going to do really well, and there could be something that doesn't even appear on this list that just shocks everybody and upsets the meta forever. Who knows?
But in 2 weeks, when we come back to another Clock Talk, it'll be post-Rumble, and we'll kind of be able to share our experiences and kind of look at what had happened. We hope to gather kind of the same information like we did last time to be able to kind of break down all 3 tournaments and see how the decks performed. We likely won't have all of that information for that Clock Talk, but look forward to following Clock Talks with that information.
Yeah, we're going to try to get as much as we can and like kind of a full recap of the event. Hopefully you found this monstrosity useful. That is all we have for this one. We will be back on Thursday with 5 cards 5 minutes talking about RWBY rares and double rares. Brandon will have his Batman Ninja Green Villains deck from the stretch goal from the Christmas charity live stream up on Tuesday, and then a week from Thursday we'll have gameplay for that, taking on the 8 RWBY standby deck that I built last time. And then in 2 weeks we're going to have that recap show where we're going to break down everything Rumble. So until next time, thank you so much for joining us. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and have a good one.
We'll see you then.